First, to you, Rabbi David Rosen, I'll introduce you in just a sentence or two. You are well known all over the world for the leadership that you exercise in advancing dialogue among the world's religions with the Jewish family. Your accomplishments are too numerous, so I won't mention them. I simply turn to you, Rabbi David Rosen, to help us get started this afternoon. Please. Right up here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wendley. I feel a little bit superfluous after the wonderful presentation by Cardinal Turkson, and almost an embodiment of the witticism, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. And so, as I have been given the privilege to say it, even though it has been said, I will hope I will be able to add a little bit. Reference has been made a number of times to Genesis 2, verse 15, of the injunction to the first humans to work the garden and preserve it. The actual Hebrew words can be translated differently, but the word to preserve it, it genuinely is consistent with the idea of sustainable development, le shomra. But it now begs the question, which has perhaps been implicit, on what does this charge presume? What does it say about what are the values that animate this mandate? And these, of course, are reflected in quotations such as Psalm 24, verse 1, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it," or perhaps even more dramatically in Leviticus 25:23, "For the earth is mine, says the Lord, and you are sojourners and tenants with me." In other words, from the biblical point of view, and obviously Christianity as well, but Judaism's primary text is therefore the Hebrew Bible, the attitude towards the cosmos, towards the environment, and indeed beyond that, is conditioned upon our recognition that we do not have ownership in any permanent sense. We are tenants, we are sojourners, which places upon us certain responsibilities. And this then leads in very interestingly that this quote, the last quote I gave in Leviticus 25, is to be found within a chapter that in fact presents a model of sustainable development. The fascinating chapter, which if we look in terms of its values and seek to place them within a contemporary context, give us fascinating guidance. This is the concept of the sabbatical year or the Jubilee year. And in the sabbatical year, where we are being told to remember that the earth is the Lord's, that we are sojourners and tenants, there are essentially three major principles at play, three major precepts at play. The first is the idea of letting the land lie fallow, that the earth should not be unlimitedly exploited. This, if you like, is a more radical position than that of the rotation of crops. But it is a recognition that there needs to be an inherent respect for the land in and of itself. The second aspect of the sabbatical year was the idea of the manumission of slaves. And it's interesting to note that within ancient Israel there were two categories of people who were in servitude. One were those who would be found guilty of criminal acts, essentially theft. And rather than a rather strange system that we seem to have adopted in our modern world of throwing people into cells and depriving themselves of their freedom without in any way making compensation to the individual who is the victim of the assault, in the biblical world, the responsibility of the individual was to compensate, and if he or she couldn't do so, then essentially their service would be provided, and they would be in servitude to provide that compensation for as long as it required. The other role of the servant was one who fell into a poverty trap and voluntarily sold his services into those of another. And then, in a sabbatical year, they still had to go free. In fact, in a Jubilee year, while they could still relinquish in the sabbatical year, in a Jubilee, they were forced to have to go free to emphasize the inalienable human dignity that even the individual cannot voluntarily forfeit. That dignity has to be affirmed. And the third principle of the sabbatical year was, of course, the idea of cancellation of debts. This was in an agrarian society. A person went into a debt in order if they fell upon a bad harvest and they needed to be able to borrow to produce for a new harvest. And if you got caught in another bad season, then you could get into a poverty trap. So the sabbatical year guaranteed that you would be able to exit from that poverty cycle. So what we have here in this model are essentially three principles. That is, the respect for the physical environment, a recognition of it, the respect for human dignity, which in modern parlance we may apply, of course, to the whole concept of contemporary servitude and trafficking, and economic viability, independence. Now, what's interesting is that this follows into Leviticus chapter 26, which then has this theme: if you observe my commandments and my statutes, then you will have rain in its season, the land will provide its increase, the trees will provide their fruit, you shall dwell on the land in security, and I will give you peace in the land. Maimonides in the 12th century, a rather supreme nationalist, couldn't make head or tail of this, and therefore concluded this must be just metaphor. And therefore the Bible needs to use language that simple agrarian farmers can understand in terms of their own worldview. But today we can understand it better than Maimonides could in the 12th century. Today we can see precisely how if these principles of equity, of responsibility for the environment, and the dignity of the individual are not applied, how this affects our rains, our fruit, our trees, our ability to be satisfied with our bread, above all our capacity to live on the land securely and to live in peace. As indeed in the lovely paper that was prepared by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and the Social Sciences for this meeting indicates, there's an intertwined crisis of poverty, exclusivism, and environment. And this is reflected precisely in those passages in Leviticus, which in a sense was summed up in the late St. John Paul II's beautiful phrase talking of the importance of a human ecology. Now, let me just conclude, after having resonated on that and the importance of our religious resources in order to emphasize what you are articulating here in the wonderful scientific papers, let me state the obvious in that religion is not one thing. And therefore one cannot talk of it as a one-size-fits-all, or to use the American expression, as a cookie cutter. Religion is a different thing from one place to another. Even within one religion, it can be a very different kind of entity within one social context to another social context. And therefore calling on religious leaders or on religion is a little disingenuous. One has to apply it appropriately in each and every context. And there obviously is no religious leader today who has the appeal, let alone the standing, of Pope Francis. But there are different roles and different responsibilities that leaders can play. The most obvious area that would, I think, be across the board is in the field of education. But perhaps not least of all is also the area of personal example. And this, I think, is something where there is an importance in terms of lifestyle, and where I would encourage and say that some of the information we saw, the scientific information, shows how problematic our lifestyle and our modern diet is. And many of you will be very familiar with the study that was done by the FOA for the United Nations on livestock's long shadow. And that this should at the very least demand of us that the kind of degree of self-indulgence in terms of animal consumption needs to change, and that even if people cannot adopt a completely vegan lifestyle, there at least needs to be some kind of example of how one can cut down in terms of meat consumption and animal consumption, and especially in institutional structures. Bottom line, of course, is our responsibility that was articulated beautifully this morning to guarantee for future generations. I would like to conclude with two stories. both midrashim, ancient homiletical texts. The one tells a story of how after God created the first human person, he took him round Eden, the garden, and said, "Look at all these beautiful things that I have created, and I have created it all for you. Take care that you preserve it, for if it is destroyed, there is none to be able to heal it but you." The other is a story that talks of a sage who was known as Choni, the circle maker, as he was considered to be a great rainmaker. And he was a kind of, in the biblical narrative, a kind of a Rip Van Winkle. But at any rate, he awoke after having been asleep for a period of time, and he found, amongst the things that he found, a man planting a carob tree. And knowing full well, he asked the man, "How long does it take for a carob tree to bear fruit?" And he said, 70 years. So he said, "Well, why are you planting it?" And the man said, "Well, just as there were those before me who planted carob trees, which I am now able to enjoy, so it is now my duty to plant the carob trees for future generations to enjoy." Thank you.
Rabbi David Rosen, we thank you. If that was re-saying what has already been said, you did that with remarkable detail and color, so we're grateful for that. We turn now to you, Reverend Dr. Olaf Svit. You are the Secretary General of the World Council of Churches, a body that represents a very large part of our human population. We invite you, please, Olaf.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Your Eminences, dear participants, dear friends, the readiness for change requires hope. The former South African president, now also the late Nelson Mandela, was fully aware that action for change needs hope. So just liberated from prison, he demanded, I quote, "Our people have the right to hope, the right to a future, the right to life itself." Hope is when somebody sees beyond the reality of today and imagine and believe in changes towards something better. As churches, and I speak here on behalf of 350 Protestant and Orthodox churches, we are not ignoring the reality, and today's help us to make it even more clear what the reality is. But we are not called to be apocalyptic. We are called to hope. And we call for hope. Among the worst actions we can do to one another as human beings is to remove the hope of others. Particularly inhuman, it would be to take the hope away from our children and our grandchildren, and I actually have one. Therefore, in this perspective, it is adequate to speak of a right to hope that we have as human beings, all human beings. It is much more than being pessimistic or optimistic. It's about hope as a gift and a power, a right to initiate and to implement changes as they are needed. Therefore, faith and hope do not ask if we will succeed or fail. They just lead us to the steps forward. Therefore, this day, we have to stand up for the right to hope. Despite all negative conditions, all negative information, we have the right to hope, and we as religious leaders have to nurture this hope. As Christians celebrating this time of Easter these weeks, we connect our hope to our belief in the resurrection as an expression that death and sin, human sin, will not have the last word in this world. As churches, we have to see that in the past and even today, we have supported a mechanistic understanding of nature, that it was to be subdued and exploited to narrow human interests. We are part of human failure, human sin. And today we also see that many are paralyzed, not able to really see, not willing to understand the reality that is presented for us today. Unfortunately, we have to say also many of those who are in political leadership look to the next election and not really far enough to make the commitments that is necessary for all of us. In the World Council of Churches, we say these days that we are on a pilgrimage of justice and peace. As human beings, we are all pilgrims in our lives, searching for something more, something to change, for hope. We have, as the World Council of Churches, raised the warnings about climate change for several decades, bringing at least some of the voices of those who have experienced them already for a long time to our meetings to let their voice be heard. And I can give you a sign of hope that we have called for these actions and reactions in our churches. And we see that many, many churches mobilize for change and to make this a matter of faith as it is a matter of hope. And I would particularly emphasize today that we see these signs of hope among the younger generation. They are willing to do much more. And we as religious leaders should let them, empower them to do much more, to lead on in this agenda for change, to lead on in this convincing atmosphere we have today, but needs to be conveyed and also to be made visible in the world, in the many communities in which we live. In New York last September, we called together with the World Conference of Religions for Peace for another consultation like this, the day before the UN Summit on Climate Change. And there we said together, in a concrete way, as people of faith, we call on all governments to express their commitment to limit global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. We emphasize that all states share the responsibility to formulate and to implement low-carbon development strategies, leading to decarbonization and the complete phase-out of fossil fuels by mid-century. End of quote. I have to say that it is a challenge for me as a Norwegian to sign a document like this, but it should be a challenge, and it's a challenge we have to face. What we have heard today make it crystal clear what kind of changes are needed for the future, for a sustainable future, for not only the South African people, but for humanity to have a right to hope, a right to a future, a right to life itself. These days, we remember one of the martyrs, also in the Protestant tradition, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and pastor who showed his responsible action and courage for others by showing that his hope drives him to take actions now. We also have spiritual leaders in our midst today, like the Ecumenical Patriarch, Bartholomew, who says that this climate change is a spiritual crisis. Spiritual values are not soft issues, not the real issues. Spiritual values are the highest values, the deepest feelings, the most solid moral platform, and the most decent qualities we have as human beings to be creative towards the future. So let us be priests together of God's creation, caring for its well-being in the presence of God. And let us together show that we offer what is needed at this point in history, namely a right to hope.
Mr. Secretary General, we thank you very much for your reflections and for all that you're doing to advance these topics day in and day out. This has been a central concern for you and the World Council of Churches. Let's turn now to you, Swamiji Tarata. Swamiji, you are a Hindu figure of a very great and distinguished lineage of Hindu temples in India. Yours is an ancient tradition, and we ask you to share with us now this afternoon. Thank you.
सर्वेऽपि सुखिनः सन्तु सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु सर्वे सुगुणशालिनः श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः. It is very historical day in the place of Vatican. All of us, we have gathered here to solve the global problem. It says only religion can solve the problem, because the problem which we are facing now, it is global, and whatever we are seeing now, it is horrible, because we are losing the hopes for our next generation. The main reason of this problem is the non-importance for the religion in our day-to-day life. The link between religion and politics or ruler, it is weakening. That is why this problem has come. If the rulers have backed with the global vision of religion and spirituality, then this kind of problem will not come at all. In olden days, all rulers, they were guided by spiritual leaders and religious leaders, and they were providing global vision, and they were providing the spirituality for the rulers. That is why they were ruling with the global vision. Nowadays, we are having narrow-mindedness, and we are not thinking about the universal welfare. That is why we are thinking about only our national spectrum and narrow sphere. That is why we are facing this kind of problem. So if our life will be led not self-centered but God-centered, then we may not have this kind of problem. In Upanishad, it is said, Ishavasyam idam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagat. This whole world is the house of God. We are only rented people. So how the rented people, they live in the house, they don't use much. Whatever needed, they use. They don't invest their money for a rented house, because they are willing to have their own house. So if we are having this kind of thinking, then we don't want to get more from this world. We can use only minimum. We may not think about our rights. Instead of rights, if we think about the duty, what kind of duty I am having to serve this world, then this kind of problem will not come. That is why spirituality is providing the vision that this whole universe is the house of Lord, and we are living here by His grace. So we should give something to Him, and we should give the rent to Him, and we should allow other people to live and let live. Then this kind of problem will not come. This vision should be given by the spirituality. Then only spirituality is going to give the balanced mindedness. Nowadays, we feel everywhere imbalance in our body and in the whole world also. Everywhere we see the blood pressure, sugar, on account of imbalance. Sugar imbalance, pressure imbalance. The same thing in the world also, imbalance. Everywhere we can see that. because we are not having the spiritual background. That is why everywhere imbalance is there. To remove that imbalance, we should give more importance for spirituality, religions. Then we can live in this world like guest and rented people. Then we can preserve the resources here, and we can provide the life right to live to our next generation also. That is why we think nowadays not only human beings are terrorists, but all human beings are becoming terrorists against the nature. So for the nature, we are like terrorists. To solve that, we should lead the religious and spiritual life, and rulers, they should consider the spiritual values. Then only this problem can be solved. That is why we hope the responsibility should be given to the rulers by the religious leaders, so they should take the responsibility. In that view, I am very much appreciating the effort from Vatican to solve this problem, along with the United Nations and Religions for Peace organizations, because they can solve this problem if scientists, religious leaders, political leaders, if they are together to solve this problem, then their relationship will be tightened, then this kind of problem can be solved. That is why I'm very glad to attend this summit in the holy place of Vatican. So this is the message to the world, that religious leaders should take the lead, and also United Nations should take the lead. If that kind of body will be formed and strengthened, empowered, then we can solve this problem of global imbalance. So that is why I hope this should be done under the leadership of His Holiness Pope here. He's having the global vision, and also United Nations is having the authority to have the contact with all nations. So if we will get together, then I think this problem will be solved. And today I feel this is the historical day in the history of human beings here, and I hope this mission will be fulfilled very soon.
Swamiji Terata, thank you very much. Leadership without spiritual values is something you have warned us against, as well as the need for collaboration. Thank you very much. Historically, in your office, you were never to internationally travel, so you have adjusted that tradition in order to be with us, and we appreciate that. We turn now to you, Emmanuel, Metropolitan Emmanuel. You representing the Ecumenical Patriarch and the great tradition that was quoted by Cardinal Turkson this morning. So, Metropolitan Emmanuel, we look forward to receiving your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me, and Mr. President, Your Eminences, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Looking into the room, I tried, when I was sitting over there, but I sit over here too, I didn't see any clock. So I wondered if this means that we are in the absence of time, which gives us more freedom, or we are the masters of time, the masters of the chronos, in the ancient Greek term, as we pretend to be the masters of the earth that we inhabit. But definitely, I think it's high time to take a lead in order to get out of the illusions and do something to save what can be still saved. I would like to thank the organizers and also this excellent initiative of the United Nations and in conjunction with the cooperation with the Holy See and His Holiness the Pope Francis. I know his commitment, and I know that this is in the same line as the commitment of His Holiness the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, whom I serve, and I think that we are all multipliers of this message in the world. The climate change and the sustainable development constitute definitely issues that are considered as part of the global crisis. Can we, however, also consider them as challenges that pertain to justice and responsibility? Of course, the word crisis has its own face value. In Greek, it means judgment, and it is true that these issues point to the negative consequences of our system and of our lifestyle. But to stop short of the crisis means to just stick to the sentence, but where is the exit? Speaking of a challenge means to be invited to think further and to act. It means to recognize the problem by seeking a solution. And a challenge calls out for a solution, stimulates, puts things in motion. How then can we think of the climate change as a challenge pertaining to justice and responsibility? First of all, a challenge for our confession of God, of the world, and of humanity. The challenge of climate change is not just a geopolitical, an economic, and a technical challenge. We can recognize a spiritual challenge as well. Are we not misled by seeing ourselves as masters and possessors of nature, a nature that has a sole and only purpose to serve us? According to Scripture, we confess the world as God's creation, in which thrives life, and one can sense the divine. Genesis 1:1-25. We therefore believe that we constitute an integral part of this good creation and recognize that the destinies of nature and humanity are intimately interrelated. In this regard, the biblical text teaches that God has given us the faithful and prudent stewardship of creation. Stewardship, and I emphasize the word. To protect humanity is to protect creation, and to protect creation is to protect humanity. A challenge that will open our eyes through contemplation. Climate change is therefore a sign of spiritual blindness. But the scales may fall from our eyes. We see ourselves as part of the creation and acknowledge God in His beauty. In our societies that become increasingly unurbanized and oppressed, we are invited to take time out, to go out to meet creation, to attend the Scriptures, and why not combine the two, thus reading our Bible in nature. Therefore, through contemplation and meditation, with the help of the Holy Spirit, we can be led to a spiritual rebirth. And feeling gratitude for what has been given to us will lead us to the realization of the responsibility to protect and to transmit. It also makes us more humble, for creation is not exhausted by scientific knowledge, nor can it be mastered by technology. Its forces and its mysteries go well over and beyond us. Third point, a common responsibility. A structural transformation of our lifestyles and consumption patterns cannot be achieved unless all stakeholders commit themselves to this purpose, which means citizens, NGOs, social movement, businesses, and communities as well as all church and spiritual movements. It has to do with questioning oneself on the appropriateness of each level of decision-taking and organization, from the local to the regional, from the national to the international. The evidence of the emergency forces us to develop a new imagination that alternatives and new forms of commitment, interpellation of policymakers, involvement in local projects, a call for accountability of the political and economic actors, local and communitarian solutions. And it has to do with putting politics back in the service of community, but also putting citizens at the center of politics and decision-making mechanisms, with a common good as its main goal and horizon. Faced with this international and globalized crisis, which is exactly what the climate change and what the climate crisis, the Church must renew the word she transmits, must remind the word of fraternity as the essential foundation of unconditional acceptance, of justice, of the most humble horizon, of all forms of solidarity, of peace for all as a condition for good life, of simplicity, gratitude as seeds of a renewed hope. To meet the challenge and path of conversion, in order, however, to meet the climate change, we must also take on a spiritual challenge, that of converting lifestyles. The spirit of conversion in Christian spirituality calls for an in-depth mutation, for a reversal of the being that touches and exceeds at the same time both the environmental and climate issues. I would say that you can meet the word metanoia, the change of the way we think, the change of nous, love for one's neighbor, present and future takes over selfishness. The collective action of believers will apply pressure on the world leaders and global decision makers. Sobriety will respond to the appetites of over-consumerism and sharing limits inequality. And finally, charity encompasses the political and the social sphere. Through fasting, prayer, and commitment, we can be led to a new life that opens up the future to the possibility of a sustainable, just, and peaceful society. Such a road to an ecological Damascus is based on a firm hope, a faith in the impossible, and namely the faith and the hope of the Easter morning to which we are witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Metropolitan Emmanuel. In your very rich paper, there were themes very similar to Swamiji Terata, who just spoke before you, about environmental degradation as a spiritual illness. And I've never heard the term an ecological Damascus, but I think Christians will understand what you're inviting them to. And so thank you very much indeed. Let's turn now to Dr. Din Samsudeen. Dr. Din Samsudeen, you are the leader of Muhammadiyah, a very large, about 30 million members of Muslims in Indonesia, a country of remarkable religious diversity as a Muslim majority state. Dr. Din, please, we invite you to take the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Venley. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is no longer a myth. Scientists, especially environmentalists, remind that natural destruction is alarming. Global warming has resulted in a cumulative global damage in nature and has threatened the survival of human life and existence of species. It further brings about political problems and sovereignty of nations. Significant decrease of crop production and water shortage caused by weather anomaly are likely to make people in many parts of the globe suffer from famine and food sustainability. As a consequence of escalating sea level, many parts of the land has a permanent flooding that increase salt concentration of water, which may extinction of certain species and agricultural production. Environmental deterioration has no doubt become a real problem from the survival of this healthy life. The question is, what can be done to rehabilitate the damaged nature, or at least to slow down the deterioration, and what's the moral dimension? Allow me to share a little bit an Islamic perspective. Islam present as for the Muslims present a solid, clear understanding of environment and climate change. It also brings about strong imperative for the Muslims and human beings at large to restore ecological collapse and accumulative global damage. There are over 750 verses out of the 666 verses of the Holy Quran urge human beings to reflect on creation, nature, and environment, as well as to perform their responsibility for maintaining equilibrium on earth and to make justice in the relationship between human being and other living organisms. Islam is described in the Quran as a religion of nature. God the Almighty has stated, "Therefore orient yourself with all due sincerity and uprightness towards the natural religion. This is consistent with the nature He, God, has created in humankind. Never will there be any change in that nature. This is the straight way, however, most human beings realize it not." Islam views that the world and all there is in it is created by God, the Creator. According to the Quran, to Him, God, belong all things in the heavens and on earth. To Him belong what is in the heavens and on the earth, and all between them and all beneath the soil. Thus, human beings from the Islamic perspective don't have ownership over the nature or environment. They only borrow it from God and owe it from the next generation. A true believer thus should maintain and respect the sacredness of nature by maintaining the balance. The Quran beautifully described the merciful has taught the Quran, He has created human being, He has taught him elocution. The sun and the moon flow along in their established orbits. The stars and trees recline humbly and in prostration. He has raised aloft the firmament of the sky and established the balance. Therefore, cheat not in maintaining the balance. Establish just measure and don't fall short in maintaining the balance. Based on this scriptural imperative, Muslim scholars have formulated some Islamic ethical principles with regard to environment and climate change. 1, nature is sacred. 2, the biodiversity have inherent ecological and utility values for humankind, both as spiritual sustenance and material resource. 3, nature has been created in order, balance, and with extraordinary aesthetic beauty. 4, human beings are members of the community of nature. 5, humankind comprises trustees and vicegerents of God on earth. 6, humankind's right over nature are rights of sustainable use of a suffract based on moderation, balance, and conservation, with a similar and equal right for future generation. 7, nature's right over humankind include the rights of protection from misuse, degradation, and destruction. 8, all patterns of man's production and consumption should be based on an overall order and balance of nature. The rights of humankind are not absolute and unlimited. The last, to prevent the appearance and emergence of corruption in ecosystem, to prevent corruption on earth is one of the primary responsibilities of all believers. Now, what can be done to rehabilitate the damaged nature? From religious point of view, we need to have new perspective on nature through reinterpretation of religious texts. This is based on the argument that human behavior is directed by their belief and religious understanding. We need a shifting paradigm from conservative theological dogmatisms to progressive standpoint. According to conservative understanding, nature as creation of God is provided to fulfill and serve human, whereby nature is seen as an object. To some extent, this understanding leads to overexploitation of nature. Notice, we need to change our view to nature as a subject. Nature is not a thing, but a living creature that has its own psyche and behavior directly affects human life. Of course, human beings can still benefit from the nature while managing its conservation. Changing modern lifestyle that is devastative to nature. Global warming is caused by excessive use of vehicle, air conditioner, spray perfume, refrigerator, greenhouses, etc. These changes include reduction of plastic usage and other material hazardous to nature. Since the usage of so-called modern equipment is inevitable, what is urgent is how to develop new technology that is environmentally friendly. Reforestation for rehabilitation and conservation of rainforests, for example, is the lung of the world. As a result of wood-based industry, rainforest has been seriously damaged, but no significant action has been taken by industrial countries. Commitment from developed countries on carbon trade is still questionable. Morally, those who have food have to wash the dishes, not the otherwise. For the future of human life and the survival nature, we need to have a joint cooperation between faith groups, policymakers, scientists, business people, and all societies. There are possibilities to explore meaningful, well-grounded interfaith cooperation at local, national, regional, or even international level. It is the time to educate green generation through eco-education, eco-city, eco-culture, and the like. For the future of our generation, we need to manage the impact of climate change by changing our vision on the nature, behavior of lifestyle, state and world policy on environment, and developing green technology. The world's sustainability is the responsibility of all. It's our religious and humanity calling. Before it's too late, why not we start now? If not now, when? If not us, who? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Din Samsudeen. Very deep reflections on Islam as it would equip its followers to respond to the challenge of climate change and sustainable development. We turn now to you, Kosho Niwano. You are the president-designate of the Japanese Buddhist community Risho Kosekai. I can simply note that your community has had a long relationship with the Vatican. Your grandfather was the, I believe, sole Buddhist observer at the Vatican Council II. So, Reverend Kosho Niwano, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you here today. I would like to share with you some of the Buddhist perspective on the given theme. Ryoanji is a Zen temple located in Kyoto, Japan. It is famous for its stone garden. At one corner of this stone garden, there exists a hand-washing pot. On that pot is carved the phrase, "I only know satisfaction." It points to an original satisfaction that is beyond ordinary pleasure and pain. It is an original satisfaction that is always present even in the midst of ordinary pleasure and pain. It makes clear that nothing can ever make us happy without a satisfied heart and mind. Mere financial, material, social, or natural blessings can never make us happy if our hearts and minds are not satisfied on this more original and deeper level. A person who truly knows satisfaction is calm in heart and mind, and a person who does not know satisfaction is confused in heart and mind, taught Shakyamuni Buddha. Buddha's teaching invites us to open ourselves to a deep paradox, namely, a poor person does not mean one who possesses nothing, but one who cannot be satisfied while possessing much. We should know that we already have enough because we exist. God and Buddha have already given us all that is needed by us. This phrase, "I only know satisfaction," expresses the richness we already have been given. We must humbly turn into this original fullness if we are to address our current challenge of climate change. Senno Rikyu, the great master of Japanese tea ceremony, noted that the central path of tea consists in the spirit of being satisfied with a house not leaking water and with enough food to avoid hunger. Preparing and serving tea when needed with not too much or too little takes time. It is first offered to Buddha, then served to guests, and finally one drinks. This is the spirit of welcoming the other, the awareness of the link between serving and one's own happiness. We have been sustained all our lives by receiving from the universe. Now we are facing the issue of climate change due to greenhouse gases. This severe challenge cannot be met on the basis of human-centered fear. The challenge calls us to shift ground to return to our original human stance. We must respond on the basis of this profound religious experience of "I only know satisfaction." This is a subtle point. Let me spell it out. Greed, fear, and insecurity do not provide a ground for solving the challenge of climate change. Rather, reclaiming that we are already blessed with what we truly need must be and must remain our starting point for addressing this challenge. Climate change is a severe challenge. Is it not, however, a message from the earth? It invites us to return to our original selves, the ones God and Buddha offer. Perhaps the threat of climate change is an invitation to return to an authentic and, in that sense, original way of life. By this, I am not speaking against all that is good in our modern experience. Rather, I am focusing on our reclaiming our, in a religious sense, original experience. Instead of thinking about how to produce short-term solutions to them, we must have action programs with results measured in decades or even centuries. I believe that religious networks such as Religions for Peace will hereafter play increasingly important roles in promoting such long-term solutions. Why do I believe this? Because the answer to that challenge is to return to our authentic and true modes of being. Technical cures are necessary, but they will never suffice. Rather, we must return to our true selves, our original hearts and minds. My grandfather, Nikkyo Niwano, the founder of our movement, Rishoko Seikai, said that everything we receive is a gift from nature. We can never give rise to right faith without asking ourselves, what is the purpose of our lives being supported by a great many things? We humans need to live in the awareness that our lives are fully interconnected and that we are being sustained by the web of all existing things. I continue to ask myself the question posed by my grandfather. What is the purpose of our lives being supported by a great many things? Thank you very much.
Reverend Kosho